Well, there's two different ways to cut crown, but there's also two different ways to fit the joints in the corner. Maybe the traditional way would be to miter the joints in the middle, and it probably takes a little less skill. If you're painting your work, that can be the easy way to go. The key to making a joint, if you're mitering it in the corner, is you really got to make sure you cut it long enough. I find a lot of times people think they're measuring long enough and they end up about a 1/16 short, and then all you can do is just get a caulking gun. Brown caulk if you're staining. This joint, this would be the cut I would make if I'm going to miter it. I'd just make this type of a cut on both ends of the board, and then they come together in the corner, and you can make some little adjustments, but you can get a pretty good joint if you're careful what you're doing and you make sure you got them plenty long enough. If the board shrinks any, though, that joint can tend to open up a little bit. Now, a lot of professionals are going to want to cope this joint. This profile is a very difficult profile to cope, but what coping really involves is I'm going to just remove the part of the wood back from the angle of this cut. If you see the angle of the cut, I'm just removing all this wood back in here. What I'm going to have left is the profile of the molding, and then that can fit over another piece. When I'm making a miter joint, I'm going to cut this same cut on both ends. When I'm doing a coped joint, the other end of this board will be square. It doesn't have to have any kind of a mitered cut on, so that can kind of save you a little bit of time. The other thing that's kind of forgiving about coping, if this piece is a 1/16 of an inch short, when the other piece comes over the top of it, you don't notice. We held the blocking back from the corner so that we can make a coped joint. You don't have to hold the blocking back from the corner if you're not coping the joints. What we're going to do in this room is we're going to do an example of both. We're going to miter one joint and cope one joint. Now, when I get ready to cope this joint, I'm going to go ahead and just cut. Following this profile, I do want to cut under a little bit. This is a coping saw. It's what I'm going to use to cut out this profile. Now, when you get your coping saw from the store, it's going to have the blade in it to cut on the pull stroke. And the reason, as best I can tell, that they do that is because it's easier on this frame to be cutting on the pull stroke. But what that does, it makes it tend to tear out on the top side. In other words, when I'm cutting on the pull stroke, if it's going to tear out, it's going to tear out on the top side. Also, if I'm cutting on the pull stroke, I have to hold it down. Whereas if I'm cutting on the push stroke, it's going to tear out on the bottom side, and also I don't have to work as hard to hold it down. Now, I'm going to just start right here. Like I said, this is kind of a time-consuming process, but I've got to cut it back underneath a little bit. Okay. It's hard to see here, but if I've got it coped right, you can see it's going to fit like so. I may not have it held at exactly the right angle, but that's the principle, is it's going to fit right over this other piece. And that took me probably 4 or 5 minutes, at least 4 minutes, to cut using a coping saw. Now, there are some tools that you can use that make it a little bit faster. This is a jigsaw that's got a special base put on the bottom of it. This is the Collins coping foot, and it's developed and patented by a guy named Dave Collins. And what it would allow me to do is to make a lot of these cuts from underneath using this coping saw. If you're going to do a lot of crown molding, you want to cope it, this would certainly be one way to do it. Now, if you're really a professional, you're going to be doing it all the time. There's also a tool called a Cope Master, and it works very much off the principle of like a key cutting machine where you have a pattern on one side and you're doing the cutting on the other. You make a pattern off of a piece of cove mold, and then a stylus follows the pattern and actually cuts the cope on your piece of cove or crown mold that you're going to install. Again, that's a fairly expensive piece of equipment. It's an investment, but if you're going to be running a lot of molding, it could be something you might want to check into. I'm going to use this piece to make a mitered joint in the corner. One of the things I can do to help myself when I'm making a mitered joint is I can take a block plane and bevel this under a little bit. The only part of the joint that will be seen is this face. So if I add a little more bevel than a 45 to it, that's going to encourage the face to meet up without the back parts touching first. So I just take this block plane. If I do this on both pieces, it gives me a lot better chance of getting a good joint in the corner. It's important, though, that I don't get out to where the profile of the trim is. But that just gives maybe a strong 1/16 of an inch of underbevel. As I said earlier, it's really important to make sure that I cut this piece long enough to where I get a tight joint in the corner. And if anything, on an inside corner, I even want to be a little bit extra long because I can actually make an adjustment using my block plane, which I'll show you later, to make that joint fit if I happen to cut this just a little bit long. Another thing that's important to me is I'm not going to nail about the last 1.5 feet going into the corner right now, in case I need to make a slight adjustment on this piece of molding, either rolling it up or down to make the joint fit. I can't roll it a whole lot, but you'd be amazed, just a 1/16 of an inch, how much difference it'll make. Okay. Okay, push her hard this way, Ken. There you go. Are we tight? Where is that blue line? Man. There it is. Just begin to wonder. One of the things you always want to be looking for when you work with molding is a snipe at the end of a piece of molding or a split on the end. There's nothing more frustrating than to cut a piece of trim and be ready to put it up and all of a sudden realize that there's a split on the end that's going to make it not usable. Also, you don't really ever want to trust the end as being square. It's kind of rough cut, really in a log form, so you're always going to want to square the ends off if you're going to make any kind of a joint at the end. At the very end of a piece of molding, sometimes you'll find a snipe. And what that means, the knives cut a little bit deeper at the very end because the rollers, the feed rollers that were holding the piece of wood down aren't holding any longer. And so sometimes it raises up in the machine and makes a snipe. And if you try and make a joint where there's a snipe in the end, it'll really make a mess. And if you leave a snipe on the end of a long piece, maybe you're not making a joint there, but it's at the other end, you're going to see it, especially if you paint. So always look at the piece, make sure it's smooth all the way out the end, and you don't have a snipe before you make a joint. Okay.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this material, don't forget to like and subscribe.